If you're from South Sudan and you've been living in America under temporary protected status, what I'm about to tell you could change everything. Just hours ago, a federal judge made a decision that millions didn't see coming. Your status, your job, your family's future, it was all about to disappear. But something happened in that courtroom that the government never expected. This isn't just another immigration story. This is about whether you get to stay in the only safe home you've known, or if everything you've built here ends tomorrow. And right now, thousands of South Sudanese families are waking up to news they never thought they'd hear. Full article, 3,000 words. The clock was ticking. For tens of thousands of South Sudanese immigrants living across the United States, every single day felt like borrowed time. They went to work wondering if this would be the last paycheck. They dropped their children at school, wondering if they'd still be here to pick them up next month. They paid rent on apartments they weren't sure they'd still live in by summer. The Department of Homeland Security had made its decision clear. Temporary protected status for South Sudan was ending. Pack your bags. Say goodbye to your American life. Prepare to return to a country many hadn't seen in years. A country still bleeding from civil war, still drowning in violence, still unable to guarantee that you'd survive your first week back. And then a judge said no. Not just no, but a full legal halt that stopped the entire plan dead in its tracks. This wasn't a delay. This wasn't a maybe we'll think about it. This was a federal court telling the Department of Homeland Security that their plan to terminate TPS for South Sudan couldn't move forward. Not yet. Not until serious legal questions were answered. For the families who had been counting down their final days in America, this court decision didn't just buy them time. It gave them something far more precious. It gave them hope that maybe, just maybe, they wouldn't have to choose between staying in the shadows or returning to a war zone. Temporary protected status has always lived up to its name in the cruelest way possible. It's temporary. It's protection? Yes. But protection that comes with an expiration date stamped right on it from day one. South Sudan received TPS designation because the United States government recognized something undeniable. The country was too dangerous for people to return to safely. Civil war had torn the nation apart. Ethnic violence had become routine. Famine had spread across regions. Healthcare had collapsed. Schools had closed. Armed groups controlled territories. Women were being targeted. Children were being recruited as soldiers. The infrastructure that makes a country livable had simply ceased to exist in many areas. So the U.S. government said, if you're from South Sudan and you're already here in America, we're not going to force you to go back to that. We'll give you protection. We'll let you work legally. We'll let you live here without fear of deportation. But we're calling it temporary because one day, when South Sudan is safe again, you'll have to go home. That was the promise. That was the deal. And for years, South Sudanese immigrants in America held up their end. They worked hard, they paid taxes, they followed every rule, they reported to USCIS, they renewed their work permits on time, they stayed out of trouble, they built lives, they became nurses and truck drivers and teachers and store clerks and warehouse workers. They rented apartments and bought cars and enrolled their kids in schools. They went to church on Sundays and grocery shopping on Saturdays, and they became part of the fabric of American communities from Seattle to Atlanta, from Minneapolis to Phoenix. And then Homeland Security decided that time was up. The announcement came like a thunderclap. TPS for South Sudan would be terminated. Not renewed, not extended, terminated. The official reasoning was that conditions in South Sudan had improved sufficiently that people could now return safely. That was the government's position. That was what they put in writing. That was what they expected tens of thousands of people to accept without question. But anyone who had been following the news from South Sudan knew the truth was far more complicated and far more horrifying. Yes, there had been a peace agreement signed. Yes, there had been attempts at forming a unity government. Yes, international observers had documented some reduction in large-scale military conflicts. But peace on paper and peace on the ground are two completely different realities. South Sudan wasn't safe. It wasn't stable. It wasn't ready to absorb tens of thousands of returning nationals who had been living abroad for years. Reports from humanitarian organizations painted a picture that contradicted everything Homeland Security was claiming. The United Nations was still documenting widespread violence. Human rights groups were still recording atrocities. Aid organizations were still warning about food insecurity and disease outbreaks. Journalists who actually traveled to South Sudan were still filing stories about communities living in fear, about roads controlled by armed groups, about women afraid to leave their homes, about a healthcare system so broken that basic medical care was nearly impossible to access. And yet the termination notice went forward. Homeland Security set a date. After that date, your TPS would expire. After that date, your work authorization would be invalid. After that date, you would be in the United States without legal status. After that date, you could be picked up by ICE and deported at any moment. The message was clear: start preparing to leave America or start preparing to live in the shadows. The fear that spread through South Sudanese communities across America was palpable and paralyzing. Families began making impossible calculations. Do we sell everything and try to return to a country we barely remember? Do we overstay and risk detention and deportation? Do we try to find another pathway to legal status even though most of us don't qualify? Do we send our American-born children to South Sudan with us, forcing them to grow up in a war zone? Do we split up our families, leaving some members here and taking others back? These weren't theoretical questions. These were dinner table conversations happening in thousands of homes. Parents were crying themselves to sleep. Teenagers were asking why they had to leave the only country they really knew. Employers were losing trained workers. Landlords were losing reliable tenants. Churches were losing congregation members. Schools were losing students. And then the lawsuit came. Legal advocates who had been working with immigrant communities knew that the Homeland Security decision was vulnerable to challenge. They knew that the law requires the government to actually examine current country conditions before terminating TPS. They knew that the evidence didn't support the conclusion that South Sudan was safe. They knew that the administrative process had been flawed, so they went to court. The legal arguments were technical, but the stakes were completely human. The lawyers argued that Homeland Security hadn't properly considered all the required factors. They argued that the agency had cherry-picked information that supported termination while ignoring mountains of evidence showing ongoing danger. They argued that the decision-making process had been politically motivated rather than based on objective country conditions analysis. They argued that sending people back to South Sudan right now would violate fundamental principles of humanitarian protection. And remarkably, a federal judge agreed that these arguments deserved serious consideration. The judge didn't rule on the ultimate merits of whether TPS should or shouldn't be terminated. That would come later. But the judge did something equally powerful in the immediate term: issued a halt, a temporary restraining order. An injunction that stopped the termination from going into effect while the legal case moved forward. That decision changed everything overnight. The South Sudanese immigrants who had been counting down their final days in America suddenly had their TPS status preserved. Their work permits remained valid. They could continue going to their jobs. They could continue paying their rent. They could continue taking their kids to school. They could continue living their American lives without immediate fear of deportation. The relief was overwhelming, but it was also complicated. Because this wasn't permanent protection. This was a legal pause button, not a reset button. The case would continue. The government could appeal. New evidence could be presented. Another judge could rule differently. The protection that felt so solid today could evaporate tomorrow if the legal winds shifted. This is the excruciating reality of living under temporary protected status. Even when a court has temporarily blocked its termination, you're never truly secure. You're never truly settled. You're always living in a state of uncertainty that most Americans can't even imagine. You make plans, but you can't fully commit to them. You invest in your life here, but you know it could all be taken away. You put down roots, but you can't let them grow too deep because you might have to tear them up and leave at any moment. For the South Sudanese community, this court decision represents both a victory and a reminder of their vulnerability. It's a victory because it means they're not being deported right now. It means their families stay together for now. It means they keep their jobs for now. It means their children stay in their schools for now. But it's also a stark reminder that their entire existence in America depends on legal decisions made by people who have never walked in their shoes, never fled from their homeland, never had to choose between danger and deportation. The broader implications of this case extend far beyond just South Sudan. There are multiple countries whose nationals currently have TPS in the United States, and every single one of those designations is subject to periodic review and potential termination. What happens in this South Sudan case could influence how Homeland Security approaches TPS decisions for other countries. It could strengthen legal protections that prevent premature termination. Or it could eventually result in a ruling that gives the government even broader discretion to end TPS regardless of current country conditions. Immigration advocates are watching this case closely because they know it's about more than just South Sudan. It's about whether the United States will honor its humanitarian commitments or whether political considerations will be allowed to override safety concerns. It's about whether the government can be held accountable when it makes decisions that put lives at risk. It's about whether courts will protect vulnerable immigrants or defer entirely to executive branch immigration decisions. For right now, though, the immediate impact is clear and life-changing for tens of thousands of people. They get to stay. They get to keep working. They get to keep their families together. They get to continue building their American lives. How long that lasts depends on how the legal case unfolds, but for today, there's relief and gratitude and a chance to breathe. The South Sudanese community in America has shown remarkable resilience throughout this ordeal. They've organized, they've advocated for themselves, they've told their stories to journalists and lawyers and anyone who would listen. They've shown up at rallies and town halls. They've written to their representatives. They've refused to be invisible or silent even when the government tried to erase their presence from America. And now they've shown that fighting back can actually work, that going to court can actually stop deportations, that legal challenges can actually protect immigrant communities when the executive branch tries to act without proper justification or process. This judge's decision to halt the TPS termination is more than just a legal technicality. It's a statement that immigrant lives matter, that humanitarian protection means something, that the government can't just wave away its obligations to people who sought safety in America. It's a reminder that even in an immigration system that often feels arbitrary and cruel, there are still moments when justice breaks through, when vulnerable people get a reprieve, when families get to stay together. The road ahead remains uncertain. The legal case will continue. The government will make its arguments. More hearings will happen. Eventually, there will be a final ruling. But for now, for this moment, the South Sudanese community in America can live without the immediate threat of forced return to a country that still isn't safe. They can wake up tomorrow and go to work. They can tuck their children into bed knowing they won't be torn apart. They can make plans for next month and maybe even next year. That's not everything they deserve. What they deserve is permanent stability, a pathway to citizenship, recognition that they've become Americans in every way, except on paper. But it's something. And in an immigration system where victories are rare and precarious, something is worth celebrating, worth fighting to protect, worth hoping can eventually become something more permanent. If you're from South Sudan and you've been living under this cloud of uncertainty, today you can breathe a little easier. If you're from another country with TPS and you've been worried that your designation could be next, this case shows that terminations can be challenged and stopped. If you're someone who cares about immigrant communities and humanitarian protection, this decision demonstrates that legal advocacy matters and that courts can still serve as a check on executive overreach in immigration matters. The fight isn't over. It's never really over when you're living as an immigrant in a system that treats your presence as temporary, even after years or decades. But today's fight was won. Today's battle resulted in protection rather than deportation. Today's legal ruling meant families staying together instead of being torn apart. And sometimes in the immigration world, that's as close to victory as people get. and it's precious enough to hold on to tightly while preparing for whatever comes next. This is exactly why you need to stay informed about every single development in U.S. immigration policy, because these decisions happen fast and they affect real lives immediately. What happened with South Sudan TPS could happen with any protected status designation. What this judge decided could influence cases involving your country, your status, your family. You can't afford to miss these updates. You can't afford to be the last person to know when a court decision or a policy change could determine whether you get to stay in America or whether you're forced to leave. So if this story matters to you, if you're living under TPS or know someone who is, if you care about what happens to immigrant families in America, then make sure you're getting these updates the moment they break. Subscribe to this channel so you never miss critical immigration news that could change your life. Hit that like button and share this video with every single person in your community who needs to know what's happening with South Sudan TPS and what it means for other protected status cases. Drop a comment below and tell me your situation, tell me what country you're from, tell me what immigration status you're trying to navigate. Because these comments create a community where we help each other understand this complex system. And turn on notifications so the second there's a new development in this case or any other immigration matter, you're the first to know, not the last. Your future in America might depend on information you get in time to act on it. Don't let that information pass you by. Stay connected, stay informed, stay ready. Because in immigration, knowledge isn't just power. It's survival, it's protection, it's the difference between staying with your family and being forced to leave them behind. You fought too hard to build your American life to lose it because you didn't know your rights or didn't hear about a crucial development in time. Let's make sure that never happens. This community is here to keep you informed, keep you prepared, and keep you fighting for the life you deserve in America.